They mocked me for working as a waitress, then I bought the restaurant. The wine glass shattered against the marble floor, crimson liquid spreading like blood across the pristine white tiles. I stood frozen, my hands trembling as the entire dining room fell silent, all eyes turning toward me with that familiar mixture of disgust and amusement. Marcus Blackwood, heir to the Blackwood fortune and the most arrogant customer I had ever served, stood before me with his arms crossed, his perfectly tailored suit unmarked by the wine that now stained my uniform. "How clumsy of you, Sarah," he said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy as his companions erupted in laughter. "Perhaps you should consider a career more suited to your, shall we say, limited abilities." I wanted to tell him that I hadn't dropped the glass, that he had deliberately knocked it from my tray with a casual flick of his wrist, but I needed this job too desperately to risk losing it over the truth. Instead, I knelt down and began collecting the broken pieces, my face burning with shame as their laughter echoed through the elegant dining room of Le Bernardin, Chicago's most exclusive restaurant. "Look at her," whispered Victoria Sterling, the socialite wife of a prominent judge, her voice intentionally loud enough for me to hear. "Crawling around on the floor like some common servant. I heard she actually has a college degree. Can you imagine, all that education wasted on waiting tables?" "What did you study, dear?" called out Jonathan Hartwell, the real estate mogul whose face appeared regularly in the financial section of the Tribune. "Advanced plate carrying, I presume." The table erupted in fresh peals of laughter, and I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest, a feeling that would stay with me for the next 3 years as I plotted my revenge. What none of them knew, what none of them could have possibly suspected as they sat there in their designer clothes and ridiculous jewelry, was that I was not just some unfortunate college graduate forced into service work by a bad economy. My name is Sarah Chen, and I am the daughter of Wei Chen, one of the most successful tech entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, though he had kept his family life strictly private throughout his career. I had been working as a waitress not out of necessity, but as part of a social experiment for my doctoral thesis in behavioral psychology, studying the way people treat those they perceive as being beneath them in social status. But as I swept up the last fragments of broken glass that night, feeling the weight of their contempt pressing down on me like a physical force, my academic research transformed into something much more personal. These people had shown me exactly who they were when they thought no one important was watching, and I was going to make sure they never forgot it. Over the following months, I became a fixture in their lives, though they barely noticed me as anything more than part of the restaurant's decor. I served them their expensive meals, listened to their conversations, learned their secrets, their weaknesses, their fears. Marcus Blackwood, for all his wealth and arrogance, was drowning in gambling debts to some very dangerous people. Victoria Sterling was having an affair with her personal trainer, and her husband the judge was being investigated by the FBI for taking bribes from organized crime figures. Jonathan Hartwell, the real estate king, had built his empire on a foundation of fraud and money laundering, selling properties that didn't exist to investors who trusted his reputation. They all had skeletons in their closets, and they discussed them freely in front of me, never imagining that the quiet waitress refilling their water glasses was recording every word on a device smaller than a button hidden in her uniform. But information alone wasn't enough for what I had planned. I needed something more substantial, something that would allow me to destroy them completely while simultaneously elevating myself to a position where they could never look down on me again. The opportunity came when I overheard a conversation between the restaurant's owner, Henri Dubois, and his business partner about their mounting financial troubles. Le Bernardin was hemorrhaging money despite its prestigious reputation, and they were desperately seeking investors to keep the doors open. The irony was perfect, I realized as I stood there pretending to polish silverware while they discussed their dire situation. These wealthy patrons who treated me like dirt were dining in a restaurant that was on the verge of bankruptcy, completely unaware that their favorite playground for displaying their superiority was about to crumble. That night, I made a phone call to my father, explaining my situation and requesting access to the trust fund he had established for me years earlier. Wei Chen had always been supportive of my unconventional research methods, and when I told him about my plans, he not only agreed to help but offered additional funding from his own accounts. Sometimes, he said in his quiet, measured voice, the best lessons are taught by those who underestimated us. Within a week, I had arranged a meeting with Henri Dubois through a series of intermediaries, presenting myself as a representative of an anonymous investor interested in acquiring Le Bernardin. The negotiation was surprisingly straightforward, as Henri was too desperate to ask many questions about the source of my funding or my true identity. By the end of the month, I owned the restaurant completely, though Henri and his staff believed they were dealing with a mysterious wealthy benefactor who preferred to remain in the shadows. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity. I would continue working as a waitress, allowing Marcus, Victoria, Jonathan, and their circle of friends to continue treating me with the same contempt they had always shown, while secretly controlling every aspect of their dining experience. I could manipulate their reservations, their seating arrangements, their service, their entire evening, all while maintaining the pretense of being nothing more than a clumsy servant girl who existed for their amusement. But I wanted them to understand exactly what had happened, to realize that the person they had mocked and humiliated had risen above them in the most devastating way possible. The revelation would come, but not yet, not until I had extracted every ounce of satisfaction from watching them continue to display their true nature, completely unaware that their victim had become their master. The first phase of my revenge began subtly, with small inconveniences that they dismissed as coincidence or incompetence. Marcus would find his favorite table unavailable when he arrived for his weekly business dinners, forcing him to accept a less prestigious seating arrangement near the kitchen. Victoria's wine selections would consistently be out of stock, requiring her to settle for inferior vintages that she complained about loudly to anyone who would listen. Jonathan's reservations would mysteriously be lost or double-booked, resulting in embarrassing waits at the hostess station while other diners looked on with amusement. None of them suspected that these annoyances were orchestrated by the same waitress they continued to torment with their casual cruelty, the young woman they still saw as nothing more than a servant whose only purpose was to facilitate their dining pleasure. As weeks turned into months, I escalated my campaign, using the information I had gathered about their personal lives to create more sophisticated forms of psychological warfare. I arranged for Marcus's creditors to be dining at nearby tables during his business meetings, forcing him to conduct important negotiations while surrounded by the very people he owed money to. The stress was visible on his face as he tried to maintain his composure while discussing million-dollar deals, all the while knowing that his gambling debts were growing larger by the day. Victoria found herself seated next to gossip columnists and society reporters on multiple occasions, her conversations about her extramarital activities inadvertently overheard by the exact people who could destroy her reputation with a single published article. She began to suspect that someone was deliberately sabotaging her social standing, but never imagined that the culprit was the waitress she barely acknowledged as human. Jonathan's carefully constructed business relationships began to unravel as I used my access to the restaurant's reservation system to orchestrate encounters between him and the investors he had defrauded over the years. Awkward confrontations became a regular occurrence during his dining experiences, as former business partners would approach his table to demand explanations for failed investments and missing funds. But the psychological manipulation was only the beginning of my plan. I had been using my position as a waitress to gather evidence of their crimes, recording conversations and photographing documents they carelessly left on their tables, building comprehensive dossiers that would ensure their complete destruction when the time came for the final revelation. Marcus's gambling problem had escalated to the point where he was now borrowing money from his own company's pension fund, a federal crime that carried serious prison time. Victoria's affair had evolved into a complex blackmail scheme, as her lover was secretly recording their encounters to use as leverage against her husband, the judge. Jonathan's real estate fraud had expanded into a massive Ponzi scheme that threatened to collapse at any moment, taking dozens of innocent investors down with it. They were all balanced on the edge of personal and professional disaster, completely unaware that the waitress they continued to mock and humiliate was the architect of their downfall. I had become addicted to the power I held over them, the knowledge that I could destroy their lives with a single phone call to the appropriate authorities, but I wanted more than simple exposure of their crimes. I wanted them to understand exactly who I was and what they had done to deserve their fate. I wanted them to realize that their casual cruelty towards someone they perceived as powerless had been the catalyst for their destruction. Most importantly, I wanted them to know that the person they had treated as less than human had risen far above them, not through inheritance or luck, but through intelligence, determination, and the desire for justice. The opportunity for the perfect revelation came when Marcus organized a private dinner party at the restaurant to celebrate what he believed would be his salvation from financial ruin. He had convinced a group of potential investors to provide the funding he needed to pay off his debts and salvage his reputation, and he wanted to seal the deal in the elegant surroundings of Le Bernardin. Victoria and Jonathan would both be attending, along with several other members of their social circle who had participated in my humiliation over the past 3 years. It would be the perfect audience for my grand revelation, the moment when I would finally step out from behind the mask of servitude and show them exactly who they had been dealing with all along. I spent weeks preparing for that evening, arranging every detail to maximize the impact of my disclosure. The investors Marcus had invited were actually FBI agents working undercover to build cases against white-collar criminals, though he had no idea of their true identities. Victoria's husband, the judge, would be arriving unexpectedly during the dinner, having been tipped off about his wife's affair through an anonymous phone call. Jonathan's largest creditors had been invited to attend as well, under the pretense of being potential business partners interested in expanding their investment portfolios. As the evening began, I moved through the dining room with practiced efficiency, serving drinks and appetizers while my targets laughed and joked, completely oblivious to the trap that was closing around them. Marcus was in particularly high spirits, boasting about his business acumen and financial success to the supposed investors who nodded politely while mentally cataloging every incriminating statement he made. Victoria flirted shamelessly with the younger men at the table, apparently forgetting that her husband could arrive at any moment to witness her behavior. Jonathan dominated the conversation with increasingly grandiose claims about his real estate empire, unaware that several of his victims were listening from nearby tables, their anger building with each exaggerated boast. The evening progressed exactly as I had orchestrated, with tension building steadily as various elements of my plan began to converge. Victoria's husband arrived first, his face dark with rage as he observed his wife's inappropriate behavior with the other guests. The confrontation that followed was swift and brutal, with accusations flying across the table as years of resentment and betrayal erupted into open warfare. Marcus tried to intervene, hoping to salvage his business dinner, but his efforts only made the situation worse as Victoria's husband recognized him as one of the men who had been bribing judges throughout the city. The supposed investors revealed their true identities as federal agents, producing badges and arrest warrants that sent shockwaves through the entire group. Jonathan attempted to flee when he realized what was happening, but found his path blocked by the creditors I had strategically positioned throughout the restaurant. Years of fraud and deception had finally caught up with him, and the empire he had built on lies was crumbling before his eyes. As chaos erupted around the table, I continued to serve wine and clear plates, maintaining the pretense of being nothing more than a helpful waitress while secretly savoring every moment of their destruction. But I wasn't finished yet. I still had one final revelation that would complete my revenge and demonstrate the true extent of my victory over their prejudice and arrogance. I walked to the center of the dining room, where the entire restaurant could see and hear me, and I began to speak in a voice that commanded attention despite its quiet tone. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my words cutting through the chaos like a knife, "I have an announcement to make that I believe will be of great interest to everyone present." The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward me, including those of Marcus, Victoria, and Jonathan, who were now seeing me as something other than invisible furniture for the first time in 3 years. "My name is Sarah Chin," I continued, "and I am the owner of this restaurant. I purchased Le Bernardin 18 months ago, and I have been operating it while continuing to work as a waitress, observing and documenting the behavior of certain patrons who believed themselves to be superior to the staff who served them. The shock on their faces was everything I had hoped it would be, a mixture of disbelief, horror, and dawning comprehension as they realized the implications of what I was saying. For the past 3 years, I went on, I have endured your mockery, your contempt, your casual cruelty, all while gathering evidence of your crimes and orchestrating the downfall that is now unfolding before your eyes. Marcus was the first to find his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. That's impossible, he stammered, you're just a waitress, you don't have that kind of money. I smiled at him, the same polite, subservient smile I had worn while he humiliated me countless times, but now it carried a different meaning entirely. My father is Wei Chen, I said, watching as recognition dawned in his eyes. Perhaps you've heard of him, he founded 3 of the largest tech companies in Silicon Valley. The trust fund he established for me is worth approximately $400 million, which made purchasing this restaurant a relatively minor expense. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of handcuffs clicking as the FBI agents began arresting the various criminals I had helped them identify. Victoria was sobbing as her husband served her with divorce papers that he had apparently been carrying in his briefcase, while Jonathan was being led away by federal marshals who had been waiting outside for my signal. But I wasn't finished with my revelation, there was still one more twist that would demonstrate the true scope of my victory. I should also mention, I said, my voice carrying easily through the stunned silence, that my doctoral thesis in behavioral psychology, for which this entire experience served as research, has been accepted for publication by the American Journal of Social Sciences. The title is Class Prejudice and Dehumanization in Service Industry Interactions, a 3-year ethnographic study. The implications of this final disclosure were staggering, as they realized that not only had I destroyed their lives and criminal enterprises, but I had also turned their behavior into an academic study that would be read by researchers and students for years to come. Their names, their actions, their casual cruelty would be preserved forever in the scientific literature as examples of the worst aspects of human nature. As the evening came to an end and the last of the arrests were made, I found myself alone in the dining room of my restaurant, surrounded by the debris of lives destroyed by their own arrogance and prejudice. The wine stain on the marble floor where this had all begun had long since been cleaned away, but the memory of that moment remained as clear as ever, the spark that had ignited the most satisfying revenge in the history of social justice. Marcus Blackwood was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for embezzlement and fraud, his family fortune seized by the government to pay restitution to his victims. Victoria Sterling lost everything in her divorce, her reputation destroyed by the scandal that made front-page news in every major newspaper. Jonathan Hartwell received a 20-year sentence for his Ponzi scheme, and hundreds of his victims finally received some measure of justice for their losses. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of my revenge was not the destruction of my tormentors, but the transformation of Le Bernardin into something much more meaningful than just another expensive restaurant. I used my platform as the owner to create scholarship programs for students from working-class backgrounds, providing them with the education and opportunities that would prevent them from being trapped in service positions where they could be subjected to the kind of treatment I had endured. The restaurant became a symbol of social mobility and justice, a place where people from all backgrounds were treated with dignity and respect regardless of their economic status or social position. Former waiters and kitchen staff were promoted to management positions, and the entire culture of the establishment was transformed from one of servitude to one of mutual respect and shared purpose. Years later, as I sat in my office overlooking the dining room where I had once been humiliated, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. I had set out to conduct an academic study of social behavior, but I had ended up learning something much more profound about human nature and the power of perseverance in the face of injustice. The people who had mocked me for working as a waitress had revealed their true character through their treatment of someone they perceived as powerless, and in doing so, they had sealed their own fate. They had assumed that social status was permanent, that wealth and connections would always protect them from the consequences of their actions, but they had been wrong about everything. I had not just purchased a restaurant, I had bought justice, I had acquired the power to right wrongs and protect others from the kind of casual cruelty that had once been directed at me. The investment had been worth every penny, not just for the satisfaction of revenge, but for the opportunity to create something positive from the ashes of their arrogance. The story of my transformation from mocked waitress to restaurant owner became something of a legend in Chicago's business community, inspiring countless others who had been dismissed or underestimated because of their circumstances. I received hundreds of letters from service workers who had experienced similar treatment, thanking me for showing them that dignity and respect could not be taken away by those who thought themselves superior. The behavioral psychology paper that emerged from my research became one of the most cited studies in the field, contributing to important conversations about class prejudice and social inequality. Universities across the country began incorporating my findings into their curricula, ensuring that future generations of students would understand the harmful effects of treating others as less than human based on their economic circumstances. But despite all the academic recognition and business success that followed, I never forgot the feeling of kneeling on that marble floor, picking up pieces of broken glass while laughter echoed around me. That moment had crystallized everything I needed to know about the people I was dealing with, and it had given me the motivation to see my plan through to its ultimate conclusion. The wine stain was gone, the broken glass had been swept away, but the memory of that humiliation had been transformed into something powerful and lasting. I had turned their mockery into my motivation, their cruelty into my catalyst, their contempt into my victory. They had thought they were looking down on a mere waitress, but they had actually been challenging someone who possessed the intelligence, resources, and determination to destroy them completely. In the end, the greatest irony was that they had been right about one thing: I was indeed just a waitress when they first encountered me. But they had failed to understand that being a waitress, or any other honest job, was not something to be ashamed of or mocked. Service work requires skill, patience, and the ability to maintain dignity in the face of disrespect, qualities that served me well in both my academic research and my quest for justice. The restaurant industry had taught me lessons that no classroom could provide, showing me the true nature of power dynamics and social hierarchy in ways that would have been impossible to understand from the safety of an ivory tower. My experience as a waitress had been the perfect preparation for taking down people who believed that money and status made them untouchable. As I watched the sun set over the Chicago skyline from my office window, I knew that my story was far from over. The restaurant continued to thrive under my ownership, serving as both a profitable business and a symbol of what could be accomplished when determination met opportunity. The scholarship programs I had established were sending dozens of students to college each year, breaking cycles of poverty that might have otherwise continued for generations. The legacy of Marcus, Victoria, and Jonathan lived on as well, though not in the way they had intended. Their names appeared in textbooks and research papers as cautionary tales about the dangers of prejudice and arrogance, their behavior preserved for posterity as examples of how not to treat other human beings. They had wanted to be remembered as important people, and in a sense, they had achieved that goal, though not in the manner they had hoped. My father had been right when he said that the best lessons were taught by those who underestimated us. The three people who had mocked me for working as a waitress had inadvertently provided me with the motivation and material I needed to create something far more meaningful than anything they had ever accomplished in their privileged lives. They had seen a waitress and assumed they understood everything about who I was and what I was capable of achieving. They had been wrong about me in every possible way, and their mistake had cost them everything they thought they valued most. Their wealth was gone, their reputations destroyed, their freedom taken away, all because they had chosen to treat another human being as less than equal based on her job title. The restaurant around me buzzed with the quiet efficiency of well-trained staff who knew they were valued and respected, a stark contrast to the atmosphere of casual cruelty that had once characterized the dining room. Customers from all walks of life enjoyed excellent food and service in an environment where dignity was the rule rather than the exception. I had proven that justice was possible, that wrongs could be righted, that the powerful could be held accountable for their actions. But more than that, I had demonstrated that the people society often overlooks or dismisses may possess hidden depths and capabilities that could reshape the world around them if given the opportunity. The story of how I went from mocked waitress to restaurant owner would continue to inspire others long after I was gone. A reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that everyone deserves to be treated with basic human respect regardless of their circumstances. In purchasing Le Bernardin, I had bought much more than just a restaurant. I had acquired the power to change lives, to right wrongs, and to ensure that the lessons learned from Marcus, Victoria, and Jonathan would never be forgotten. Their mockery had become my triumph, their cruelty had become my catalyst, and their contempt had become the foundation upon which I built something truly meaningful. They had thought they were looking down on a waitress, but they had actually been staring up at their future judge, jury, and executioner, too blinded by their own arrogance to recognize the danger they had placed themselves in. The broken wine glass had been replaced, the stain had been cleaned, but the memory of that moment remained as vivid as ever, a constant reminder of how far I had come and how much I had accomplished. They had mocked me for working as a waitress, and then I had bought the restaurant, along with their dignity, their freedom, and their futures. Justice, it turned out, was a dish best served with a side of irony and a healthy portion of poetic revenge.